The bell above the door chimed softly, one of those old-fashioned sounds meant to feel welcoming, though it rarely reached anyone's ears past the second table. Frank Mallory paused in the threshold of Brandon's table, a small-town restaurant tucked between a florist and a boutique gift shop, where the booths were leather-bound and the ceilings hung with Edison bulbs that gave everything a sepia glow. The air smelled faintly of rosemary, lemon vinaigrette, and just a hint of citrus cleaner. The place prided itself on being elevated yet familiar. That's what the chalkboard by the door said anyway. He stood still for a moment, not from hesitation, but from memory. The uniform he wore had taken time, each medal pinned with precision, the collar pressed until it lay flat with soldierly discipline. His shoes shined, his posture upright, despite the way age tugged at his spine. It wasn't for show. It was for someone. Frank stepped inside. The chatter softened, not silenced, just shifted. A few eyes lifted. A hostess with red nails and a Bluetooth earpiece glanced up, then smiled in that retail sort of way that didn't quite reach the eyes. "Hi there, just one today?" she asked. Frank nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He didn't explain, didn't offer the context he had rehearsed, the date, the name, the memory. He simply followed her as she led him to a table near the center. Not quite the window, not quite the corner. Neutral. He took his seat slowly, knees stiff from the walk. The napkin was linen. He unfolded it with care, laid it across his lap. He didn't see Troy Brennan at first. The owner stood at the far end of the room, half concealed by the polished edge of the bar, arms folded, lips drawn into a flat line. His eyes, sharp beneath meticulously styled hair, scanned the room like a stage manager watching a performance that had just gone off script. Frank's uniform, army dress greens, complete with service ribbons and a combat badge, didn't match the aesthetic. Troy moved. His shoes clicked with purpose as he crossed the room, weaving through servers and trays, ignoring the subtle stares of two college-aged diners whispering behind water glasses. He stopped beside Frank's table. "Afternoon, sir," Troy said, polite but not warm. "Are you dining in?" Frank looked up. "Yes, if that's all right." Troy hesitated. "We've got a dress code," he said. "No graphic tees, no hats indoors, and, well, uniforms draw a lot of attention. Some guests find it uncomfortable." Frank blinked once. Slowly. "I only wear it once a year," he said softly. "Today's a Remembrance Day. For a friend." Troy offered a tight smile. "Understood. But this is more of a modern dining experience. We try to maintain a certain ambiance. I hope you understand." The words were courteous, but wrapped in a chill. Frank's fingers rested gently on the tablecloth, thumb brushing the edge of a fork. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. "I won't be long," he said. "I just wanted to sit where we used to." Troy's jaw tensed. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave, sir." Across the room, a couple exchanged glances. A teenager lifted their phone, recording silently. Julie, the head server, stood frozen with a tray in her hands, her mouth parted just slightly in disbelief. Frank didn't stand right away. He looked down, at the napkin he hadn't used, at the chair across from him, the one left empty for a reason no one else knew. Then he nodded once, and rose. He refolded the napkin with care, set it beside the plate. Then he walked out. No protest, no anger, only silence. Outside, the air had cooled. A breeze tugged at the flag across the street. Frank eased down onto the bench outside the restaurant, one hand resting lightly over the medals on his chest. He didn't cry, but his fingers curled slightly, clutching the lapel of his jacket as if to hold the memory in place. Behind him, the door swung closed, and the rain began to fall. Not on the sidewalk, but in memory. The street was quiet now, save for the soft chirping of a crosswalk timer and the rhythmic rustle of trees bowing under the wind. Frank Mallory remained on the bench outside the restaurant, posture rigid, yet somehow tired. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, just forward, where the road bent toward the town square, and the world pretended not to notice the ache in its elders. There was something about the way Frank sat that told stories no words could. His uniform didn't shine with vanity. It was threadbare at the cuffs, slightly faded at the seams, pressed with care, but not perfection. It was clear this wasn't some display of nostalgia. It was reverence, worn not for attention, but for remembrance. He came to Brandon's table once a year, same date, same seat. His friend Lenny had always liked their Meatloaf Tuesdays, back when the place was just a sandwich shop with sticky tables and a jukebox that skipped. Lenny, who once danced with a waitress during a blackout while holding a flashlight between his teeth. Who wrote letters in block print because cursive made his hands shake. Frank had known him since boot camp. They were boys when the war began, and different men when it ended. Or maybe not men at all. Just survivors trying to fit back into peacetime skins. Lenny never married. He said the war took his best stories and left only echoes. But he laughed loudly and gave big tips. And every year on his birthday, Frank came here. Ordered 2 plates, ate only 1. He hadn't told anyone why. Not the staff, not even Julie, who'd seen him enough times to know he was more than the medals on his chest. Frank had always been known in town, though he never sought attention. He wasn't the type to join parades or give speeches at the VFW hall. He visited schools, yes, not to boast, but to make history human. He brought his helmet, his canteen, the bayonet he never used. Told children how cold a foxhole could get, how silence could feel louder than bombs. His wife, Elsie, used to say he was made of quiet strength, the kind of man who didn't need the world to applaud him. Just a clean shirt and someone to listen. She passed 6 months ago, in her sleep, peacefully. He still hadn't moved her shoes from the hallway. It was Elsie who'd encouraged these remembrance visits. "Go see him," she'd say. "Laugh once for both of you. Order the lemon pie." Today he had come without her voice, and without the pie. And now, without even the chair across from him. As he sat outside the restaurant, Frank looked down at his hands. Scarred in places, knuckles stiff. Hands that once held rifles, dug trenches and carried friends. Today, they shook faintly, not from weakness, but from memory. He could still smell the jungle sometimes, when the air grew humid and the rain held a thickness to it. He could still feel the weight of Lenny's shoulder slumped across his, the whisper of breath before it stopped. He hadn't spoken that day's story aloud in years. It belonged to the uniform now, and yet here he was, refused a seat because of it. A memory in human skin. Inside the restaurant, no one looked through the glass. They had gone back to their meals. The clink of forks had resumed, but the air felt colder than before. And across the town, in kitchens and barbershops, in break rooms and silent cars, a whisper would begin to move. Because sometimes it only takes one quiet injustice to stir the hearts that had once stood in formation. Inside Brandon's table, the floor was clean enough to reflect the hanging Edison bulbs, and the ambient jazz murmured like a lullaby through the air. The servers moved with practiced rhythm, each table a minor stage in the day's service. But beneath that polished surface, something had broken. Not loudly, not visibly, but in the subtle way people stopped making eye contact. Julie watched from the corner. She'd been holding a tray with 2 sweet teas when Troy approached Frank's table earlier. She hadn't heard the full exchange, just fragments. Something about a dress code, a misunderstanding maybe. But she saw the way Frank looked up, the way his body tensed slightly, like a tree bending under wind it didn't expect. Now she stood behind the bar, tray forgotten, watching through the front window as Frank sat on the bench outside, back straight, eyes unfocused. Troy had returned to the kitchen. No victory in his step, just certainty. He believed he had protected the brand, upheld the tone of the place. "It's about consistency," he said, brushing past Julie. "We're not a Legion Hall." Julie didn't reply. She just stared at the door. Frank hadn't argued. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't caused a scene. But the image of him standing, folding the napkin, placing it beside the untouched plate, had left a bruise inside her. Out front, Frank's shoulders moved once, Not a sob. Not quite. A tremor. He adjusted the medals on his chest, as if grounding himself through steel and ribbon. A teenager at a nearby table whispered to their companion, "Was that guy kicked out?" The other shrugged, eyes still on their phone. Looked weird coming in like that. Julie turned away, throat tightening. In the kitchen, Troy was already reviewing reservation stats. "You can't let sentimentality override business," he said to no one in particular. "A uniform draws attention. Makes people think there's a promotion or something." But Julie didn't hear him anymore. She was hearing Frank's voice, soft, uncertain, as he tried to explain. "This belonged to a friend. I wear it once a year. Today's his birthday." And Troy's answer, dry and clipped, "Well, this isn't a tribute museum." Julie blinked hard. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. She'd worked here for nearly 6 years. She'd seen families celebrate birthdays, anniversaries, first dates. She'd seen people bring flowers to their own tables, buy dessert for strangers, raise toasts to lost loved ones. But today, the man who came to remember quietly, to honor someone who never came home, had been asked to leave because his memory didn't match the decor, and no one had stopped it. Outside, the sky dimmed slightly, clouds drifting in over the square. Frank remained seated, a statue in a storm that hadn't yet begun. And inside, Julie made a quiet vow. This wouldn't sit right. Not in her heart. Not in this town. Not for long. The rain had fallen for 3 days without rest. In the dense Vietnamese jungle, rain was not just weather. It was a presence, a weight, a whisper that crawled down your neck and into your bones. Every tree dripped like a wound. Every root threatened to twist an ankle. Every breath came damp, close, and tasted faintly of gun oil and fear. Frank moved low, his rifle pressed to his chest, one boot sliding silently over the slick floor of the jungle. Mud clung to his uniform. This very uniform, though back then it was newer, greener, still holding the scent of stateside starch. His face was streaked with camouflage and sweat, but his eyes were sharp, focused. Beside him, dragging one leg and biting back groans, was Lenny. Corporal Leonard Harlan, Lenny to the guys. The one with the kind eyes and the half grin that made the war feel a little less cruel. He was the sort who whistled during rations and carved birds out of soap on downtime. Said he was going to marry a kind woman when he got back. Teach their kids to laugh. "Joy's the only force the world still needs more than bombs," he'd say. But now he was bleeding badly. Shrapnel had torn through his side during the last push. The medic's bandage held. Barely. They were moving toward the rendezvous point. 15 minutes to evac. Frank felt Lenny slipping. His weight dragged more with each step. Frank scanned the jungle ahead. The foliage thinned, the trail tightening into a muddy vein. Then, just beyond a fallen tree, he spotted it. A wire. Low. Silent. Waiting. Trip mine. He froze. Breath shallow. Boots buried. If they'd tripped it, there'd be nothing left to evac. Very slowly, Frank lowered Lenny to the ground, propped him against a thick root. "Stay with me," he whispered. "I'll clear the way." Lenny nodded faintly, eyes fluttering. Frank crawled forward, palms sinking into mud. His hands moved instinctively, a field engineer's muscle memory from training. He disabled the trap with a steady hand, sweat stinging his eyes. No flash, no boom, just the ticking of a second gained and another breath earned. He returned to Lenny. "Hey, almost there," Frank said, lifting him again, arms aching, legs shaking. Lenny didn't answer right away. But after a moment his voice came, low and slow. "You ever think what comes next?" he asked, smiling through pain. "When this mess is done?" Frank adjusted his grip. Lenny continued, dreamlike. "I want a porch swing, a dog, maybe 2 noisy kids, a wife who laughs too loud at her own jokes. I want to grow tomatoes, burn pancakes on Sunday. I want to live like I didn't spend a year learning how to die." Frank didn't speak. He just kept walking, one step at a time through the crushing heat and the relentless rain. Lenny's voice dropped to a hush. But if I don't make it, don't, Frank muttered. Don't say that. If I don't, Lenny pressed. Promise me one thing. Frank paused, breath catching in his throat. Promise me you'll wear it when you remember me, Lenny said. So people don't forget us. His voice cracked on the last word. Then, still smiling, eyes distant but soft, Lenny exhaled and didn't take another breath. By the time Frank reached the clearing, his own legs nearly gave out. The medevac bird circled once before lowering. They tried to take Lenny from his arms. He didn't let go until the stretcher touched down. Later, when he unfastened the uniform for the last time, Frank folded it the way soldiers fold flags. Precise, reverent, sacred. He wore it once a year, this day, so people wouldn't forget. The wind had picked up slightly by the time Julie stepped outside. She didn't have a reason, not one that could be explained to management. The shift wasn't over. Her tray sat abandoned on the counter, but something pulled her feet forward, a quiet moral ache that wouldn't leave her chest. She found Frank still on the bench, posture perfect, eyes fixed on something far past the parking lot, maybe time itself. She didn't say anything. She just brought him a cup of coffee. Black, hot, served in a to-go cup with no lid, just the way he always took it. Frank turned slowly and gave a small nod. Thank you, he murmured. Julie hesitated before returning inside. She didn't want to break the silence between them. It wasn't heavy. It was holy. That night, she couldn't sleep. The moment replayed in her head. Frank folding the napkin, his voice calm but edged with quiet disbelief. This belonged to a friend. I wear it once a year. And Troy's reply, sharp and thin, this isn't a tribute museum. She opened her laptop, her fingers trembling a little. Logged into the town's local forum, Elmville Voice, a message board that mostly traded lost dogs and church bake sales. She posted under a pseudonym, Server Mom 82. A veteran came into the restaurant today wearing his uniform. Quiet man. Said he was remembering a friend. The owner asked him to leave. No yelling, just heartbreak. That's not who we are. That shouldn't be okay. She didn't name Frank, didn't shame the business. She just told the truth. The thread caught fire. By morning, there were dozens of replies, then hundreds. A user named Delgado13 posted, "Was it Frank Mallory?" Another, "I saw him at the War Memorial last year. Brought flowers, saluted the names like they were family." Another, "My dad served with a Mallory, said he saved 3 guys during a night ambush, never talks about it." By noon, Julie's phone buzzed nonstop. Tony Delgado, retired Marine, now barber, shared the post on his shop's Facebook page. "You kick out one of us, you hear from all of us." He tagged local veterans, not to protest, not to cause a scene, just to be present. In the background, a quiet mobilization began. Old uniforms pulled from closets, shoes polished, ribbons pinned. No calls, no flyers, just memory finding its voice. Julie stood behind the counter the next day, watching the restaurant hum around her, unaware of the storm coming not with anger, but honor. And across the town, more eyes opened. Respect had begun to rise. It began with a shadow, then 2, then a slow, steady rhythm of boots meeting pavement. Frank didn't notice them at first. He was walking the same route he always did, headed toward the square. Not to go back to the restaurant. That chapter had closed quietly. It was simply habit now, the kind of routine that keeps grief from settling too deep in the bones. He wore his uniform again, not because he thought it would be welcomed, but because the day still mattered. Because remembrance wasn't contingent on permission. But then he saw him. Tony Delgado. Broad shoulders. Close-cropped hair now more gray than black. Dressed in full marine blues, standing with both hands folded respectfully in front of him. He gave a short nod to Frank. "Morning, Sergeant," he said. Frank paused. Slight confusion. Recognition. "Tony?" The barber smiled faintly. "Didn't sit right, what happened? So we figured we'd come. Stand a while." Frank turned, and his breath caught. Behind Tony stood two more men in uniform, navy, judging by their dress whites. Further down the block, near the lamppost, a woman in an Air Force jacket stood quietly, arms crossed, eyes forward. Frank blinked slowly. They weren't talking. They weren't protesting. They were waiting. He looked behind him. More had come, from side streets, from parked cars, some older, walking with canes, some young, recent tours still written across their shoulders. They filled the sidewalk, not with anger, but with memory. And then, the restaurant door opened. Julie stepped out, not in her apron, but her jacket. In her hands was a tray of coffee cups, mismatched mugs from the kitchen, a few paper cups, two ceramic ones with chips in the glaze. She walked directly to Frank and handed him one. "Still no lid," she said softly. Frank took it. He didn't trust his voice to speak. Julie looked at the gathered crowd. "They just showed up," she said, eyes glassy. "I didn't call anyone." Tony nodded toward the window. "He sees us." Inside, behind the glass, Troy Brennan stood frozen. One hand still held the morning's prep checklist. The other gripped the edge of the counter. He hadn't moved in a full minute. The sidewalk outside his restaurant now stood lined with uniforms, rows of service, stripes of history, the living faces of sacrifice, and not a single one of them raised their voice. Frank sipped his coffee. The warm bitterness steadied him. He didn't come today to make a point. He didn't come for a moment. But now, the moment had come to him, and he was no longer alone. Troy Brennan stood behind the front counter, chest rising and falling too quickly for someone who hadn't moved. The morning had begun like any other. Coffee deliveries, reservation check-ins, a quick call to the produce supplier. But now the sidewalk outside looked like something from a photograph in his grandfather's garage. Except this wasn't sepia-toned or staged. It was now. It was here. He watched the crowd, unsure how to measure what was happening. They weren't shouting. They weren't carrying signs. But their silence had weight, heavier than any protest. He noticed the uniforms first. Army greens, Marine blues, Navy whites, faded jackets patched with insignias older than he was. Their presence pulled at something in him he hadn't felt in years. Memory, and then guilt. Julie stood at the edge of the sidewalk, talking quietly to someone with a news camera. He hadn't even seen them arrive. A local crew, the kind that usually covered bake-offs and city council meetings. But now they were pointing lenses toward his front door. He stepped out. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air shifted, not louder, not colder, just clearer. Every eye turned to him, not with hatred, but with calm expectation, as if they were giving him a final chance to see what he hadn't before. He opened his mouth. No words came. Julie approached and handed him a folded slip of paper. He opened it. A handwritten note, signed by 3 kitchen staff. "We're sorry. We didn't speak up, but we knew it was wrong." At the front of the crowd, Frank stood holding his coffee, his back straight as ever. His eyes met Troy's, and for a moment, neither man moved. Frank didn't raise his voice. He just said, "We came for a meal, that's all." The sentence landed like a stone in a still lake. Troy staggered backward a step, not physically, emotionally. The image of his grandfather came to mind, the one he never visited enough. The man who sat on Thanksgiving with ribbons on his lapel, telling old stories Troy never asked about. The shame came sudden and complete. He turned to Frank. "I didn't see you," he said, voice rough. "Not really, but now I do." Troy stepped back, then opened the front doors wide. "Please, come in, everyone." No fanfare, no speeches. He walked to Frank's side, placed a hand lightly on his shoulder and led him inside. Not as a gesture, but a correction. A waitress appeared with menus, hands shaking. Julie returned to the floor, not in uniform now, but in solidarity. She slipped into the booth beside a woman in a flight suit, sharing quiet glances of respect. Someone placed a single slice of lemon cake on the table in front of Frank. "For Lenny," Julie said. Frank looked at the plate. Then, around the room. The tables were full, and every one of them had earned their seat. The restaurant no longer sounded like it used to. Gone was the clink of casual silverware, the idle chatter about lunch specials and weekend plans. In its place was something quieter, deeper. Conversations spoken in low tones, glances exchanged like unwrapped letters, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full. The veterans filled the booths and bar stools without taking over. They didn't dominate the space. They simply belonged there, as if their presence realigned the room to something truer, something long overdue. Frank sat near the center, where sunlight filtered through the window just enough to catch the edges of his medals. He hadn't removed his jacket. He didn't need to. No one asked him to now. Across from him, an empty seat remained. It wasn't symbolic. It was real. A space kept open not for drama, but for memory. The chair Lenny never returned to, the birthday lunch he'd never eat. The slice of lemon cake sat untouched in the center. Frank reached for it gently, slid it toward the edge of the table, then placed one hand flat beside it. He didn't speak, but his eyes said everything. Gratitude, remembrance, pain, peace. Troy approached again, this time slower, shoulders lowered, ego stripped. "I've given this place a lot," he said quietly, "but not enough to the people who gave me the freedom to run it." He looked around, then back at Frank. "This place is yours today. No charge, no conditions, just thank you." Frank didn't smile, but he nodded, not for the gesture, but for the change behind it. Troy turned to address the room. "If there's anyone here wearing a uniform, now or ever, your meal is covered. Today and every Tuesday from now on." Julie, seated at the edge, looked up. She didn't smile either, just blinked fast and let the moment settle. One of the youngest veterans, barely past 30, stood to help an older man to his seat. A woman in fatigues raised a glass of water and a quiet toast. At the far table, someone hummed taps just under their breath. Frank sat back slightly, eyes misting as they scanned the room. This wasn't about winning. It wasn't about protest. It wasn't even about being right. It was about being seen, about being allowed to remember, without shame, without rejection, without apology. He raised his coffee in a soft gesture toward the cake. "To Lenny," he said. A few others echoed it. And for a moment, the war wasn't behind them. It was beside them, carried, honored, and held. It didn't take long for word to spread. By the end of the week, a picture surfaced online. Frank seated by the window, uniform crisp, slice of lemon cake in front of him, flanked by veterans whose stories stitched across decades and deserts. The caption read simply, "We came for a meal, that's all." The photo was shared thousands of times. The post made its way to military family groups, veteran networks, even to national pages dedicated to service remembrance. Comments flowed in like warm rain, sons thanking fathers, granddaughters tagging grandmothers, strangers typing thank you to names they'd never know. Troy didn't step into the limelight. He didn't give interviews, but something inside him shifted. The restaurant began keeping one table permanently reserved, small near the entrance with a folded flag, a framed photo of Lenny, and a plaque that read, "This table is reserved for those who served, especially when the world forgets." Every Tuesday, a little extra is made in the kitchen, just in case someone walks in wearing a story on their chest and silence in their eyes. Julie didn't return to the restaurant. Instead, she used her savings to open a cafe near the square, a smaller place, cozier, with handwritten menus and local photos on the wall. She called it the Honor Cup. Veterans drink free. Frank visits both places now, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, always wearing the same jacket. Not because it's tradition, but because it's a promise. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor, sacrifice, and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and comment below to share a story or memory of someone you honor. Your words could remind someone they're not forgotten. The best way to carry forward their legacy is to keep listening. Click on the next video now, and together we'll walk through another chapter of courage, one story at a time.